just grab it and talk.
Just grab it when you're speaking?
Yeah.
Okay, so we apparently don't have tabletop stands, so whenever you're speaking during your, just grab one of the microphones. And we're gonna have them low when nobody's speaking, but he's got the low.
You don't have to check it if it's working out. As soon when you're lifting it up, I'll bring it up to the house. So we'll go from there. So this one.
Do you know if there's a plug around here for plugging things off?
It's by here.
It's in the podium.
If I can stretch your doctor. I'll make it work. It's part of my job. You got it? That's fine. Show you the torsion? Yeah, you're good. Awesome. Get your clips. Just give me a second. Will you be okay to place it in front of you if you will talk?
You want us to move it so you know when to turn it off?
No, I can turn it off anytime wherever we're speaking. It will work better if it was closer.
Sure. You can do that.
Because it's broadcasting out there.
Be really close. Welcome. I'm Ira Glass.
You like this, you know, set up right in front of yourself. You don't have to really lean to that.
Exactly. Good.
Will it be enough if we just turn it to one way or the other?
Okay.
Can I top off on a water? Try not to drink anymore. Don't drink it. Just look at it. Just put your finger in if you're real thirsty.
Hi, everyone. We are just about to get started. My name is Megan Harrington. Welcome to our session. I work for Americans for the Arts, and I'm going to be this session's staff monitor. So I just have a few quick announcements before we get started. This session is called Monuments, Public Memory, and the Artist. The 3 stated learning outcomes for this session are as follows. Explore the high stakes and unique issues associated with memorial projects and find common best practices among, what must be a broad and disparate set of stories. Learn to balance the expectations and needs of a shifting community, government policy, artists' rights, and the demands of history. Consider the systemic discriminatory reality that has led to certain narratives trumping others, and how to dismantle and reconsider the power, impact, and nature of public monuments. Also, a reminder of a few of Americans for the Arts policies related to accessibility, which is part of our ongoing work to pursue cultural equity. So first, we at Americans for the Arts believe that amplification benefits everyone and that no one should need to request that someone use a microphone in order to understand effectively. As such, we have instituted a policy that anyone who is saying something that is meant to be heard by the entire room must use a microphone. So during our Q&A portion, we have these 2 standing mics here in the audience. Feel free to line up behind them if you have a question that you would like to ask. And in that same vein, please refrain from side conversations as they are disruptive to your fellow attendees and they can keep them from fully hearing the session's content. Thank you so much for attending our annual convention and enjoy the session.
We'll see if this works. Does that work?
Yep.
Sounds like it. My name is Sara Conley Odenkirk, and I'm a fine arts attorney in Los Angeles. And I'm going to be moderating today's panel of 3 experts here. What I'd like to do is just give a very brief introduction of each of the panelists, and I'll lay some ground rules out for the conversation. And then we'll go down the row, and each person will give a short presentation about their work and how their work connects to the topic of today's panel. Once we're done with that, they will sit down and we'll have a conversation up here, but really the idea today would be to have a dialogue with all of you. So I'm hoping that this will not be an hour and a half of us droning on and you getting antsy in your seats. And what we'll have instead is us kind of giving some basics and background and war stories, and then we'd love to hear what you have to say and your thoughts on the topic at hand. So, as the lawyer here, I thought it was appropriate for me to just give a very, very brief couple of basics about the law around monuments. I'm sure that everyone has been very well aware, and I'm so thirsty. Denver makes me really thirsty.
No. It's your lip story, too.
So there have been obviously a lot of Confederate monument issues in the news in the last many months now. But there are other issues that have come up as well that are not necessarily related just to the Confederate issue. Many of you may have followed the Dr. Sims statue in New York, the issue that came up there. And so looking at monuments, certainly for what the underlying context is and what the issues are is important. One of the reasons it's important is that we've got a couple of competing legal bases here that need to be taken into account. Certainly what's raised all the time with the Confederate monuments, and others as well, is the issue of free speech. Who has the right to make speech? Who has the right to express that by symbolic speech, which would be the art? And what happens if there's a disagreement over the message that that symbolic speech conveys? So when we look at First Amendment issues, and I'm sure many of you have to deal with those at some point or another in your offices as well, many of the public spaces that we're dealing with, if we're talking about public parks or streets, you're looking at traditional public forums. And in traditional public forums, there's a pretty wide range of what's allowed there. And that's why we have rules about allowing for public protest, and that's why we have to tolerate protests and marches and things that we don't necessarily agree with, because we do have a very strong feeling that free speech is an important tenet in our country, which I'm not sure many people disagree with. However, if you apply these content-neutral regulations to things like monuments, you end up with a challenge, right? Because you're not going to necessarily neutralize the message of a monument by putting another monument next to it. And how many monuments do you have to actually put up before you've created a message that encompasses all viewpoints? You might end up with no park left and just a big block of monuments. So This was one of the issues that came up in an important case, Summum versus Utah. Maybe it's the other way around by the time it gets to the Supreme Court. And in this case, what was interesting is that the court found in the end that the government has to maintain a viewpoint when it comes to accepting donated works. And as long as you have a policy in place that takes into account the community perspective, you can be discriminating in terms of discriminating not in the sense, in any other sense than choosing one over another. You can make choices that reflect what the community perspective is. And that's how we get to the ability in a lot of cases to take these things down, right? It's about eliciting opinions from the community, finding out what the community feels, and making a decision based on that versus basing things simply on a sterile policy. And the court recognizes that by maintaining a policy of strict neutrality for places like public parks, for monuments in particular, that would lead to very crowded parks, or it would lead to a policy where you can't accept any monuments. So it's important to understand that there's a difference between the way we treat monuments and the way we treat free speech that is temporary and passing, where you can accommodate lots of different viewpoints and you can have a policy that is content neutral but allows for any opinions to be expressed. That's going to be looked at a little bit differently than when you've got permanent installations. So with those tensions in mind, what I would like you all to be thinking about while the panelists are speaking is to think about first of all, what are the issues that you're dealing with within your communities? And then how do we go about coming up with some solutions? There's not going to be any one solution for every community, of course. Everybody comes from different places and there are different perspectives that need to be allowed to be expressed. So, should we go back to the idea of everything being temporary and not permanent? Is permanent passé? Is permanent too difficult? What do we do when there is a permanent piece that at the time it was installed reflected the community values, but the community has changed, and now there are different values or different information about that person who's been memorialized or that perspective that's been memorialized? How do we deal with that in a way that's respectful to as many people as possible and in a way that preserves our community standards and allows us to live in communities that make us feel welcome and happy? So with that, Vinnie, why don't you start us off? Oh, I should say, let me just give you the very brief introduction. Vinnie Bagwell is an artist from Yonkers, New York, and she's going to talk about her practice. Sara Lindgren is a public art administrator for the city of Louisville, Kentucky, and Ryan Patterson is a public art administrator in Baltimore. So with that, now you know why they're experts.
Good afternoon. I am what you call a born artist. I didn't go to school for art. I just started off as a little kid that could draw very well. High school, I started painting. I went to college to become a psychologist, but then I decided to pick up graphic design, and then I became a public relations specialist, and for the last 25 years, I've been doing public art. So hi, I am Vinnie Bagwell. And throughout all of this adventure, one of the common themes is, oh, it's going across the bottom. Okay, so anyway, I'm a storyteller. And all of my things are going to be going across the bottom like that, so I'll have to read them to you. My job is telling our stories and honoring cultural legacies. This is Frederick Douglass at Hofstra. The call for Frederick Douglass said, we are looking for a public artwork that represents the history, the achievement, and the aspirations of people of color. The children, or students rather, at Hofstra had a protest against Hofstra because Hofstra is a certified arboretum. They've got, at that time, they had 70 public artworks and none of them represented people of color. Of course, Hofstra is a Jewish organization or a Jewish institution, but over the years, it has become very diverse. And so the students demanded that the university represent the student population. So Frederick Douglass is number 71, and he's cool. I saw him yesterday, and he still looks like that after 10 years. This is Legacies, which is in Memphis, Tennessee. It is to represent the history and the culture of Hispanic Americans, African Americans, and Native Americans. So this particular artwork, because of the budget, created a style for me. You'll notice that there's bas-relief sculpture on the bottom. That has now become a signature for me. Ella Fitzgerald is my first public art project. I created it myself. I went to the city of Yonkers and I said, all you have, this is in 1995, all you have is war heroes and dead presidents. You don't have any women, you don't have any artists, you don't have anybody that represents the community today. And I think that Ella Fitzgerald, who is an artist, a woman, and an international music icon, I think we should do her before she dies. It turns out she died while I was working on it, and the commissioner for public art for the city of New York called me up to inform me that she is the first public artwork to be commissioned by a municipality of a contemporary African-American woman in the United States of America. That's kind of cool for me. So my style is grounded in realism, or as my daughter who graduated from Patterson says, naturalism, and it's candid portraiture. Three-dimensional sculpture, and I move the viewer with narrative bas-relief techniques. Again, these are the backs of three-dimensional sculptures. That's Martin Luther King. I use montages. I do a lot of bas-relief. This is for the piano lesson at the Signature Theater. Ruben Santiago Hudson was the director of that play. Symbols, text, dates, Braille, the details matter for me. And so again, my goal is to use a lot of detail to hold people's eye. My goal is not just to capture their eye, but to hold their eye. So facial expressions and body language matter to me. Line and texture add visual intrigue. And my subjects have souls who speak to the viewer. And, went the wrong direction. Go back, go back, go back. And are meant to be engaged. This is actor Clayton LaBeouf, who was on The Wire, came up to Yonkers with his daughters one day and sent me this picture, which I thought was cool. I use natural stones, incised text, graphics in the granite, and all of this is to create intimacy with the viewer. I want people to interact with my artwork. I'm presently creating a sculpture art garden to honor enslaved Africans in Yonkers, New York. The project is important because the enslaved Africans who lived there were among the first to be manumitted by law. John Jay wrote the law 64 years before the Emancipation Proclamation. And if you think about it, there are no really major monuments to enslaved Africans. So this is the site that I will be putting it on. It's almost an acre, not the whole length, but it's a good amount of space, which is wonderful, on the Hudson River. That's the New York skyline, the back behind the George Washington Bridge. And this is the new design. Again, to the left will be the river, and this is kind of how it works. I use professional photographers to document. I have in-studio workshops for youth. I bring in, these are fifth graders. Sarah Lawrence College is in Yonkers. So the goal is to bring students into the studio because public art, sculpture is not offered in the community. Elizabeth Seton University in New Jersey did a business plan for me last year voluntarily. So I do exhibitions, artist talks, focus group meetings, in-studio public previews, public events, and social media for me is a big deal. I have 2 Facebook pages. I have like 8,000 friends, 2,500 followers, 3,000 fans. I mean, it's a lot of people, and they're extremely engaging. I develop project websites, and presently I'm working on a public artwork for the state of Connecticut, and it's going to become the first sculpture of a contemporary African American for the state of Connecticut. That's a big deal. Again, that's the design. Presently, I'm getting ready to install Marvin Gaye. He's being cast for DC. And I'm starting the 3rd and 4th of 5 sculptures for the enslaved Africans rain garden, again to honor enslaved Africans. Thank you. Is that 5 minutes?
Speed.
It's working. Hi, I'm Sara Lindgren. I am a public art administrator with Louisville, Kentucky, with the city government. I am in an office called Advanced Planning. It's part of our division of Louisville Forward, which combines economic development and community development. I'm going to give a quick overview of 4 monuments in Louisville that relate to our topic here today. And just a little apology to anybody that was in the difficult dialogue session with us yesterday. You have to, unfortunately, listen to me say some of the same things twice, so sorry about that. This is, the first story I want to tell you about is about the Confederate Monument in Louisville. It was built in 1895. It was commissioned by the Kentucky Women's Confederate Monument Association, which was a predecessor of the Daughters of the Confederacy. The monument was already a subject of debate 5 to 10 years after it was installed and came up periodically for decades. Advocates declared it a piece of our history and a memorialization of the dead, but people were concerned about both the content and about the traffic pattern around the monument. In 2012, the university, I'm sorry, I skipped a point, let me go back. I wanted to say that 120 years ago, when it was built, the site was on the outskirts of the city. And now that site is right in the middle of the University of Louisville campus in an urban setting with thousands of students streaming by daily. In 2012, the university built Freedom Park adjacent to the monument as a counterpoint and to address Louisville's history of race relations and add some context. That's the center image. There were these structures set around the park with text panels and also glass panels featuring specific historic figures. We had done all of our homework and we had exhausted all of our possibilities to contextualize. This monument is 70 feet tall, so it's kind of hard to strike a balance. The mayor in Louisville announced in 2016 that the monument would be removed from its original site. It was ultimately dismantled and moved to a Civil War battlefield and reenactment site in Brandenburg, Kentucky, about 45 minutes away from Louisville. So it's still accessible to anybody who wants to visit. Our community had made clear that an appropriate context was important. Just another story about this monument quickly. Since our session today deals with the artist's perspective, I wanted to tell this quick story. This piece is well documented about how it was developed. When the Women's Monument Association was established to build the monument, it raised the money and selected a Louisville-based female sculptor named Enid Yandel, and this is her design on the left. It includes a bronze figure of Fame holding a wreath down at her side. Despite the fact that they had a blind jury artist selection process, a group of society gentlemen intervened after Yandel was selected and accused the group of fraud, dismissed them from their volunteer post, publicly humiliated them in the newspapers, and then proceeded to give the commission to a local monument company called the Muldoon Monument Company with the money raised by the Women's Association. And the end result on the right is sort of a marketable showpiece for the company, and in fact, they were advertising themselves in the Confederate Veteran newspaper as the producer of so many of the country's Confederate monuments, and that they had cited them across Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Arkansas, and Georgia. So what the point of the story, what it tells us is that the project was less about artwork and less about commemorating the dead and more about control. I'm going to show a couple of other pieces really quickly. I got to go faster. In August of 2017, after the violence in Charlottesville, this piece, the John B. Castleman Monument, became the center of the dialogue in Louisville. It was vandalized several times, and essentially the debate in Louisville is over whether this piece is a Confederate monument or is not a Confederate monument based on the figure's history. He was a Confederate soldier, he was also a U.S. soldier, he played several other civic roles in Louisville. This is another piece that became the focus of debate. This is George Prentiss. He was a newspaper editor and was known as one of the instigators of the Bloody Monday riots in Louisville. It was associated with a political party that was very anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, and caused a lot of trouble with the riot around an election time, so really controlling people's right to vote. And then just one quick final story about a piece that was installed much more recently, within a few years ago in Louisville, and this piece honors Mother Katherine Spalding. She was famous for her work around the early 19th century in Louisville, along with the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth, a Catholic order. And they did a lot of social service. They did education for girls, which was unheard of at that time. Now, the reason this piece gets a little complicated is that it is not commissioned by a government agency. It was commissioned by the church, but it's placed on public property. And the church was very interested in the piece being on public property because they were excited about it being the first statue of a woman on public property in Louisville. It's mostly funded by private donations, except for one Metro Council representative who gave some of their discretionary funds to realize the project. And more recently, research has brought about the fact that the sisters owned slaves, and they've been dealing with how to acknowledge that fact and reconcile that. Okay, so that's all of my examples. I'm going to hand it over to Ryan.
Hey guys, thanks for having us. My name is Ryan Patterson. I'm the Public Art Administrator for the City of Baltimore's Baltimore Office of Promotion in the Arts. We're the Events, Festivals, Film Office, and the Arts Council for the city. I do the public art program. We do not do historic monuments, but I've been very involved in the discussion around Confederate monuments since it came up. Citizens began calling for the removal around 2015. We created a mayor's special commission to review Confederate monuments that focused on 4 specific monuments. And over that time, we saw artist interventions and vandalism occur. There was also protest sculpture or counter sculpture placed there. And while we have policies about maintaining art to best practice, we don't necessarily have policy about how to address this art. And so that was raised as we went. A quick timeline after the removal of the statue in Durham, our local activists called and threatened to do the same to the monuments we had. So overnight, the mayor acted decisively to remove 4 monuments, and learning from the cost and struggles that New Orleans had bravely put forward in removing theirs, we found a private assistance and removed the monuments in one night without major security, and did it very quickly. While that was a brave and bold action, it also left a lot to be considered. And again, without policy in place, we weren't exactly sure what would come next. We woke up the next morning not having even been privy to know that that might happen, and a group of stakeholder city bureaucrats were on the phone deciding what to do. And we said, we will not remove graffiti that is placed on the monuments. We're going to let it stay for a little while until we figure out what happens. And meanwhile, citizens called DPW, and faster than I've ever seen a graffiti task force move, they removed graffiti. And there were people who maybe woke up understanding that their statues had been gone and they were going to reassert other ways of control in that area. At the same time, activists who'd been calling for artists and activists who'd been calling for the removal found their piece vandalized as well. So that was a troubling situation. We could barely keep ahead of things as they unfolded. Where are we now? We have 4 pedestals almost a year later, And I'm proud to say that we recently had a meeting that seems like we are coming to a consensus on how we'll deal with these. And I think we can look forward to some exciting steps, but the policies still haven't been written about what might happen. This has not dealt with all of our issues. We have other monuments that continue to be attacked, and this is a Francis Scott Key monument. And we still have sculptures that need to be addressed and relocated. If we have time, we'll get into that story later. I don't know what slide we should end on. I'm gonna keep there.
Okay, no, it should work with me sitting back here. Okay, so this is really great in terms of understanding a little bit of the different perspectives in different communities, as well as your experience, Vinnie, in dealing with the commission aspect of it from the artist's standpoint. Let's start with old monuments for a moment, and Ryan, if you and Sara could very briefly address what the situation is in your communities with regard to policy. Do you have policies in place that are informative as you struggle with these challenges in your communities?
Just for clarity, with old monuments or new? You said old.
Sure. In Louisville, we established guidelines for public art back in 2013. They primarily dealt with new projects, accepting donations, et cetera, and did not go into great depth about deaccessioning, because in a city government, deaccessioning is not the same as a private collection, and there's surplus policies and all kinds of complicated things. So the deaccession policy had not totally been dealt with. More recently, with sort of what's been going on since August of last year, when we had the two pieces vandalized that I mentioned earlier, the mayor first announced we're going to review all the public art monuments in the city. So everybody wanted to see this list. You know, where's the list? What's on the list? And so we held a public meeting and opened it for public comment, and this was hosted by our Commission on Public Art. And it became clear from that meeting, from our input from the public that were in attendance, was that they didn't want hasty decisions. They didn't want to rush into something and maybe remove something just because it was, you know, the media scandal of the moment. They wanted criteria, they wanted expertise from a variety of people, not just public art people, and they wanted meetings held in different places of the city, different times of the day, to make them as accessible as possible. So that's what we did. We kind of pressed pause, reconfigured our strategy, and started again in February of this year with an advisory committee appointed by the mayor that had lots of different disciplines, and we held the meetings all over, different times a day, and that process wraps up at the end of this month. And so the point of that process with the advisory committee was to establish principles and criteria with which we would evaluate existing works of art. So what are our values? How do we make these decisions? What comes into play before we decide we're going to keep, remove, or alter a monument?
Yeah, just it's similar. We have a city agency that's the Commission on Historic and Architectural Preservation that's focused on historic preservation. Historic monuments created before our 1964 Percent for Art law fall in their camp. So anything that's a monument or memorial of that time, and we have several, really are not in our public art collection, but are in this more of a historic monuments collection. They do not have a deaccession policy, they have a care and maintenance policy. That's why I think our more contemporary art viewpoints were brought into the conversation, but we do not have, we still don't have a clear set of guidelines. We similarly created this review process to deal with the ones in front of us then.
So based on your response, and it sounds like from what you were describing as to how you handled the controversies that came up, that there was a public process that was instituted, and that's something that maybe at some point will lead to a more generalized policy. But for all of you, whether it's for new monuments or deaccession questions, how do you solicit those opinions of the community, and how do you address the opinions that are expressed in a way that's respectful, but also takes into account what you want the end to be? Vinnie, do you want to start?
Yeah, I will. For me, because I have a public relations background, I'm already sensitive to communicating with the community. So, for instance, now that we have social media, we have email blasts, we have newsletters. So basically, how I've been approaching it, and the way that I'm seeing it approached in my county. For instance, Yonkers is one of the few places where we're really a community. It's a relatively large city in New York State. It's 200,000 people, but it has a small town mentality, so to speak. So when I want to get word out, I send information to the churches, I send information to the nonprofit organizations, I send them to all the political people, and I ask them to partner with me by getting the information out. And I have really great turnouts. And again, word of mouth, I'm visible in my community, people know who I am, and so, as I talk, people help me and they share on their social media and different things. And so it's just about developing relationships with the constituents or the organizations or whomever is really shepherding or caring for the community in general. It's like we're a family that spreads the news that this is what's going on, be there or be square.
But how do you distinguish between community input and the couple crazies that show up and start questioning loudly what you're doing?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a difference, right? We all have the difficult people in the communities that are very, very vocal. And those are the people that tend to sometimes create issues when you still have a majority of the people feeling that their concerns have been responded to. So how do you handle that and keep that small but vocal element from taking over the process?
I handle it. I've had crazy makers over the years. In Memphis, there was a crazy maker. I heard about her coming. In other words, she was announced. So I actually saw this woman storming across the way, and I turned and I said, "You must be Mercedes." And then I said, "Give me a hug." And she was like, "Oh my God, you're crazy." I said, "Come on, give me a hug." And so, when I just shook her up, and she's giggling, Karen, I was like, "What's on your mind?" And so she had concerns, but she was what I call a squeaky wheel. Same thing in, where else? Oh my God, DC, crazy makers, again. And usually what I try to do is I try to go direct to them myself. Because if it's my work, it's like I want to hear everybody's opinion, and then I feel that it's my prerogative to sift the chaff from the grain. And so usually what I try to do is I try to literally give them extra attention so that they can feel like they're being heard. Because I think that's all they really want. They want the attention because they have opinions. They're intense people, and they require attention. If you try to ignore them, it's going to be going like south.
All right, so Ryan and Sarah, I imagine you don't hug people who are disagreeing with you.
Sometimes you got to know when to hug, but can I? So I think, it's easy to think of like the best practices for public meetings and kind of the things we all like want to do, but then when you are in these positions where you're making up policy on the fly a little bit or process, the best points I can say are to be out front with what you're going to do, be consistent and predictable, so that when you're called to task by that person who's maybe being a little irrational or a lot irrational, you can say, "Nope, we actually did what we said. We put out, yard sign kind of things at each monument early on. I said, there's going to be a review about this. There's 3 ways to submit your opinion: writing by mail, email at this address, or online, or I think it was email, and then come to this meeting on this date, and it'll be an open call." Or an open forum. So when people went down a tangent on Facebook or wanted to argue with me in other forums, I could say, we've let you know those spots, that's where you can bring it. Don't send a letter to my office, don't come in person, because this is where it's going to be. And I made sure that they had space when we came to that meeting. The other thing is just the consistency in that, so that you're not going to change anything you said. And I have to thank colleagues at the mayor's office and the Commission on Historic Architectural Preservation. If you're collaborating, and you have to all be on that same page and not share misinformation to the public.
Yeah, I guess my answer would be similar to what Ryan has shared in that the important words are transparency, consistency, but also a little flexibility, so that you kind of set up your plan. You're going to have public meetings. You tell people well in advance. You let people give you their email address so that you can let them know personally that there's more information. We posted everything online. We did everything in a public meeting, so there were no closed sessions where people felt like they were missing a portion of the discussion. And that was awkward and hard sometimes for people to discuss really delicate topics in front of a room full of people with strong opinions about the subject. But we did it, and we stuck to the plan. We accepted online comments, because not everybody wants to come to a public meeting and stand up in front of everybody and say something that's difficult to say. We accepted email, we accepted written letters, we did a social media campaign, hashtag monumental letters, and we did like a postcard that had a template that encouraged people to write something to a monument. So, dear so-and-so monument, I feel blank because blank. So what we wanted to get to was the why, the because underlying their opinion, beyond just keep it or remove it. Why. We wanted to know what their values were, what the underlying reasons were. And that was how we started to develop those principles and criteria. So we also did Facebook Live videos, which was how hundreds of people followed the process. We posted them online afterwards, so you could see them after. So, and the other thing we did was pop-up events. So, for example, the one monument I showed you, the equestrian piece, is in the middle of a roundabout in a neighborhood that does an art fair. So suddenly the committee said, oh, what are we going to do about this piece in the middle of our art fair? And we said, well, we'll just be there and talk to people about it. It's an opportunity. So as people were walking by and eating ice cream and whatever, we talked about it. And we heard from a lot of people that way. And the last thing is our public radio station was really good in supporting us and covering the material, and even had an online sort of Q&A and invited people that were on all different sides of the issue. So that's pretty much it.
Great. So given how much time and effort obviously goes into the process of engaging with the community, does it change your perspective on whether you want to continue accepting memorials into your communities? Do you want to continue bringing on those potentials for controversy, or are monuments so important to people that you're willing to take that risk on? And Vinnie, from your perspective, does it make you question your practice as an artist in doing memorial pieces, or do you feel like maybe it's time to look at some other way of expressing?
No. There's the work that I make for myself, and then there's public art. And public art is somewhat prescriptive. Whether I'm creating it, the commission myself, or whether I'm being commissioned. And so I think of communities as blank sheets of paper, and I believe in mapping communities and their history, because many communities across the country are changing their demographics. Like, for instance, I'm in Yonkers. Originally, the downtown waterfront was blighted. Now it's the site of luxury houses. So it's changing the demographic. But what we want people to know is that the city is rich in history, and we want to tell those stories. So you've got the new people and you've got the old people, and the question is, what matters? So again, this is the purpose of having the charrettes and the community forums and the historical symposiums and the public events in studio and things like that, because you're introducing them to the whole idea of public art and how it serves the community, how it has meaning.
But as those, as those communities change and shift, and as those perspectives change and maybe different stories come to the forefront, how do you as an artist feel about having your art removed because maybe it doesn't speak to the stories that people want to hear at that point?
I think that at the moment that's not a concern for me because there's so much process in place before the monuments are created that when they are actually created, they've already been thoroughly vetted. And so there hasn't been enough change in any of the communities that I've worked in where the artworks have changed context. So I can't really speak to that because usually my work is received so positively. People love the depiction and the meaning and everything. So I can't answer that because that's not part of my experience, luckily.
Can I go first?
Yes.
Well, I would say sort of three things on that question. One is that I'm prepared to say that the city public art initiative that we have, we don't have to oversee every project. And some projects need to be driven by private individuals or organizations. We can be supportive and we can help them understand best practices or guide them in the right direction, but it doesn't always have to be a project that comes from the government. So that changes the nature of it, number one. Second, we're always going to encourage that group. So say a private group does proceed with a project, we're going to encourage them to engage the community, their neighbors, their neighborhood, whatever community means for that particular project. It could mean the people on your street, it could mean the whole neighborhood, it could mean the whole city. It just depends on the project. And we would work with them and you know, sometimes a group might come to you with the idea for a project and they're sort of not aware of this whole ongoing dialogue or some other kind of dialogue that they really need to be aware of before they do that project. So I feel like our job is to help them be aware of the things that they should be aware of and that they should consider, and not necessarily to dictate what should or should not be in the project, but to help them be aware and find the resources. And then the third thing is I would just always tell people it doesn't have to be forever. Your project doesn't have to last forever.
So your answer is that no, you've not been daunted by the idea of bringing in more memorials or monuments?
I'm gonna say hesitant, but not completely against it.
I will just quickly say that so we have a very strict set of public art guidelines, and then we have a very conversational and loose gifts of art policy, but we use that gift policy to have those conversations and to bring people around. And we always start, before we've dealt with this issue around the Confederate monuments or anything, we've always started with is a figurative representation the best way to represent that person or the ideal you're trying to represent? And if it comes out that it's yes, and that's the only answer, then we review that for location and appropriateness. I think in general we had a dissuasion towards, you know, representing people who were recently passed or were pretty contemporary, because our city has a lot of historical monuments, and a lot of times when private groups come forward, it's another white guy, and we don't always need another white guy, you know, and so we are not looking to do every mayor that came the last 12 years. But that said, you know, I think there's an opportunity. It just needs to be considered and explored. I will bring up kind of different issue. I'm concerned about the obligation we may have as a city and the arts community to preserve informal memorials, not things that are per se monuments commission, but after the tragic death of Freddie Gray and the citywide response of anger that came, understandably, a mural went up very fast, completely outside of our office, but it's become a memorial to Freddie Gray's life in that moment. And I don't know what 10, 20 years from now people will say, why haven't you guys been preserving that? You know, and so that's a whole nother issue that I don't know how we're gonna be faced with that.
Unsanctioned memorials. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So at this point, I could go on with many more questions, but is there anybody who would like to raise an issue that you're dealing with? There are microphones, so there's one here and one over on this side.
Thank you. This is really very helpful for me and I think my colleagues. I'm Andy Witt from St. Augustine, Florida. And we have lots of history, Lots of monuments from various perspectives. Not all of it is nice. And we are currently addressing a Confederate memorial that the City Council has agreed to keep the memorial, but they're going to add context. So the first question is, what is context, and how long can it be on a public monument? The second item, and I wish you would answer this, is if you remove the monument and you have a pedestal left, doesn't that make as much of a statement as before? Third item, when does public art become a monument? When will the Calder sculpture in Chicago become a monument versus public art? Thank you.
I could just address the pedestal issue. I think we've been wrestling with that locally from both the conceptual perspective and the technical bureaucratic side. Those sculptures, 3 of the 4 had easements by the state. And while they were able to remove them overnight in that swift move, the pedestals are still there in part because they are not sure of the legal boundaries around removing them. So yeah, they are a statement, and we haven't been able to fully address using them or utilizing them maybe purposefully because of the legal issue. I think we're getting to a point where we might be able to, but it's been a point, at times a proud statement and sometimes a sore spot that still remains.
I would say that even, regardless of whether we're talking about memorials and monuments or Calder sculptures, there are issues around deaccession. Mm-hmm. So, and those are really crucial issues for communities to be addressing, but certainly for very different reasons. When you're talking about sculptures or monuments that elicit very strong opinions because of the expression that they contain, that's different from a public art piece that has either become very dear to the community or has always been hated by the community, or there are other reasons why you may or may not want to keep it in your collection. But in general, just as a larger umbrella, it's really important for people to be looking at those deaccession policies on all fronts, looking at funds for maintenance and care of all the objects within a collection and what's respectful to the artist, what's respectful to the community. So unless it turns out that there's something very controversial about Calder, I don't think it's going to end up in the same category as the monuments.
I want to talk about context. You asked, what is context? Context has to do with how you perceive something and what it means to you. So I'll give you an example. In Yonkers, there is a monument that went up privately to honor Gold Star mothers whose sons or perhaps daughters were killed in combat in war. We all, not all of us, but many of us hate the sculpture itself, but we appreciate the context. I was at a party the other night and some woman rolled up on me and says, "What do you think about the Gold Star monument?" And I looked at her before I go, she said, "I hate it." And I said, "I don't care for it, but I respect it because of what it means." So context has to do with what it means. So for instance, with the movement now with the removal of the Confederacy is that all of a sudden now we're realizing that those sculptures represent a certain kind of propaganda, and the context is white supremacy. And despite the tenor of the times in our leadership, there's still a large population in this country that are sane and well-balanced, and they understand the meaning, the real meaning of that, and we're trying to grow past that. And so, like for instance, I live in Westchester County, New York. The Arts Westchester, which is the Arts Council, is the largest arts council in the state. They're well-funded, and they're now assessing and taking an inventory of the county's artwork, and they're weighing and measuring context. What does it mean? Does it mean what we want it to mean? And if it doesn't, then now the question is, what is the process for removal? So far, we haven't found any that we want to remove. Like in Yonkers, we have several of those that are up in the air, but then when we actually find out what they're about, it's like, oh no, we can't take that. That's the Spanish War Memorial, and that honors all of the people who died in the Spanish War Memorial. But if you didn't know that, you would think that it's something else. So context is what gives it value one way or the other.
And I think another layer of that is that some communities are adding additional context. Is that what you were, is that part of your question?
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to put a QR code on the base of a historic monument that has a multi-page website, or there is a plaque that has context in it, but the practicality of context of something that's so complicated is very difficult. So where does it end and where does it begin, and how are you dealing with those types of issues to get that information out in a way that's still accessible?
Right, well, in the example that I gave earlier, in 2012, the university where the Confederate monument was located in Louisville added these additional objects to try to bring a counterpoint and to balance the space and tell the additional narratives that were not told through a Confederate monument. But in that particular case, it just wasn't enough. Now, it's not to say that it can't be done successfully, but in that case, it just still wasn't enough to make people feel like there was a balance. And so in our current advisory committee, this was one of the biggest topics of question and contention was, when you write these principles, do you say that the city can consider adding additional context as an intermediate step before removing something? Or is that just a loophole and an excuse? And so what we arrived on is defining a very specific set of criteria. I'm going to go over them really quick. So it would be having a public process to develop what that context is. It would be comprehensive research on the original object that's made accessible to the public, and that the additional context reveals all the historical narratives, or as many as possible, and that this is my favorite one, that the scale and impact of this additional added context reflects or exceeds the original monument. So if you have a 70-foot tall monument, you can't put a 3-foot tall sign, right? That's not enough. And then the last one was that it is this additional context, whatever that might be, is located appropriately so that one cannot see the original without also encountering the additional piece.
Those are great guidelines.
Can I add one more?
Yeah, add one.
All right, so I think that is the really proper, good way to do these permanent new contexts, because we did, like, the most we could do was put up a quick little sign and it wasn't enough. I think now what I'm trying to do is to create a policy for artists to respond in context. It's basically a permit to perform or do a temporary project, and we don't have that, and so I think that needs to be something we have. That this is how you apply to do a project there and get it reviewed and get it permitted so I can push it through Recreation and Parks or whoever. And that's kind of a fun way to approach it. I think it's at least a guideline to do it.
Do you want to repeat those briefly?
Repeat them again.
There was a request to repeat the guidelines. Can
Oh,
you do it
repeat
briefly?
those additional criteria?
Yeah, we did all the research and we want to know it.
Okay. Okay, so, well, these are also, you can see our draft, on our working draft that we have in Louisville is posted online. If you search for Louisville Public Art, you can find it there, but I'll go over them really quick. So the first one is a public process, has to be included in developing the additional context. Comprehensive research on the original object is made accessible to the public. The additional context reveals divergent historical narratives. The scale and impact reflects or exceeds the original monument, and it is located appropriately so that the original object cannot be viewed without the added context. So it's 5 total. And I was just going to say one more quick thing, your question about will a Calder at some point become a controversial monument, but I think, that seems unrealistic at this point, but what we are seeing across the country is artworks or monuments changing in symbolism and coming to mean something that they were never meant to mean in the first place, and that they become a rallying point for a group that may not reflect the values of the overall community. So we do have to be aware that these things happen.
And that's why I tend to be very wary about the idea of putting things in context rather than taking them down.
Right.
So I think sometimes that desire, the desire to put things in context does give government and community a way of being wishy-washy about something that we should not be wishy-washy about.
Yeah.
Which I'm not sure exactly what the answer to that is, but it's a big concern because I don't find it difficult to make a decision about Confederate monuments.
Right.
But I do see how other issues might be more complicated.
Yes.
Right. We made you wait a long time.
So, can you hear me? Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay, I just couldn't tell. So I'm Susan Brown, and I'm from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where we have Silent Sam. So I'm fairly new in my role in the arts with the town, but I've been a town employee for about 5 years. So I don't know if I have a question, but I'm looking for words of wisdom or lessons learned, especially from Sara and Ryan as employees of the cities. Yeah. So Silent Sam is on the campus of UNC. So it's a really tricky thing because it's on a state campus, so the state legislature and the state historical group ring in. It's very visible from the main street, and it's just probably 30 steps in from public property. So what happens is almost everybody wants it gone, but it's still there. And so the town council can write the letters and ask for it to come down. I guess my struggle is, as a town employee, being responsive to the community and hearing that everyone wants this down, but also trying to preserve town gown relationships which are precarious, and sort of being asked to organize a public art piece right across the street from it. And I'm like, I'd also like to keep my job, guys. So do you have any words of wisdom as a city employee? And I mean, I think that we can burn bridges with the one or two crazy folks that show up, but burning bridges with major civic institutions where you can't make progress in our town without working with the university, help me.
Yeah, is there a state level process or protection over it?
There is.
Okay.
There is. So it's currently, and there are many, many efforts being taken. So there's currently a bill making its way through the legislature because it's been vandalized several times. And I love the fact that you moved your statue and you kept the paint on it. That was awesome. I think you showed that. They're now trying to take it through the pieces being, there's a piece in the state law that if the piece is being threatened, if it can't be preserved, it could be taken down. There's a public safety piece. Right. So the historical commission, I think they keep punting it down. So now the legislature is trying.
Well, it seems like until some of those pieces play out, one thing you could consider is your role in providing a platform for people to talk about it. Because sometimes I think we find in our communities people have an opinion until they learn more, to your point, about some of the additional stories or facts or narratives that go along with it. So, can you hold forums where lots of different viewpoints can be heard, like not only one side and not only your side and your side, but everybody's side.
Right. So I'm also the director of the Chapel Hill Public Library, which is a really nice thing. So we did a sort of public forum with people talking about it, and it was great.
Yeah.
But just curious, so yes to Matt, and any other ways, just as a public employee, did you feel threatened, or did you feel nervous or vulnerable?
I felt right in the middle of it, and so trying to gain as much education as I could, also
opinions and viewpoints changing because we're human beings and we're learning. And I really felt important to reach out to as many people as we could, right? And even people who I don't always agree with and don't always work great with, they want to be involved, help them be involved. Give a grant to a small org that might lead those meetings so it's not you and not affiliated with you. Call on your public historians of all backgrounds. Sometimes an art historian might be the most academic person, but they also might have a strong opinion that they make out front. And so bring in people who are going to pull on facts and let those conversations flourish like 1,000 fires around you until the dust settles, and then say, look, they hashed it out, and it was proven when you look at the record, you know, and these were racist monuments because of all this. I'm not telling you, look at what happened, you know.
I would just say one thing about the public safety issue. I'm very wary about hanging your hat on that sort of an excuse. I don't mean to be sounding so negative, an excuse to take the monument away. My concern is that if the public safety reasoning ends up being the reason that stuff comes down, it's encouraging people to be threatening and not engage in conversation, and instead engage in vandalism and terrorist activities.
Absolutely, and I think that they are running as many options up the pole: public safety, art all of it. So thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Nancy Lovendahl. I'm the founding chair of the Basalt Public Arts Commission, which I'm sure you've heard about because we're a 6,000 person town on the western slope of rural Colorado.
We know all about it.
Exactly. I have a question about contemporary memorials. We're a small town where so many people feel that they've contributed to the fiber and text and context of a town. And willy-nilly, unsanctioned memorials are going all over, and the town is being expected to preserve them and, of course, value them equally. And they're everything from the mayor's dog to people who have legitimately put hydroelectric plants in that sustain the town. So, I mean, it's like soup to nuts. So the Parks and Open Space committee that works with the Basalt Public Arts Commission are trying to centralize a memorial location and sort of find a way that everybody can bring their memorial into one space. And I guess I'm looking for creative ideas as to how to talk about it, invite people. They're thinking of some sort of very idyllic arch that everybody's got their names hanging on it. And I'm just here to ask rather openly, where would a good place to start be?
Have you considered temporary?
A gift policy.
Temporary is difficult with memorials.
Yeah.
Fortunately, we have an incredible sense of place in the mountains, you know, that you can almost make it an aspiration on a mountain that it is your memorial mountain. But this is going to be close to a river, and it's going to have to be something with people's names on it because everybody's freaking out unless they can put a name on it.
Do you have a gift policy?
Well, that's what we're trying to define. That, you know, some people want to make a generous donation to the town just because it was such an incredible sense of place for their family, let's say, to mature there. So there's that, there's the dog, there's the hydroelectric, you know, founder, there's the mayors that have been, you know, really very good civic work. I don't mean to belittle it, any of it, but it's becoming such a patchwork, it's just getting out of control.
What about a rotating exhibition? Like, you know, you had space designated, and there's an annual or biannual sort of event and a selection panel, and so people get a chance to display the artwork, and then a year later or 2 years later, somebody gets a chance, or is the emphasis only on permanent?
I think that everyone is afraid of having some sort of space that they have to really spend a lot of money on preserving. So a walkway or an arch or something that has a very simple addition to it, that when it gets full, do another arch type of thing and create a corridor is one idea.
Okay, so I just want to understand, is this a city initiative or is it a private initiative? Okay, then I would say that why wouldn't you consider putting out a call for proposals? You could always, if you find a phenomenal architectural landscaper, you could design a sculpture park, a sculpture garden.
That's definitely one idea.
But I would say that either put out a call for an architectural landscaper, someone you say, okay, this is the template, this is the land that we're going to use, and let them decide. Like, let's just say, I don't know, how many artworks are we talking about? Like a few, like 7 or 8? Or are we talking about like 27 or 100?
No, it's meant to be one artwork that holds the memory of thousands of people in time.
Right. But even that, I'm saying that begs for a call for artists or a call for a creative who might come up with the perfect idea, and then all you have to do is decide, do you like it, and then figure out how to fund it. It's nice if you have funding set aside. Like, for instance, I hate it when people say, give us your ideas, but they don't give a budget. It's like, no, you have a budget, because there's my $5 million idea, and then there's my $5,000 idea. So
no, it would be boundaried. It would have a budget.
Right.
I guess I'm looking more, what kind of a public conversation needs to be with this? I mean, we build something and then we're just going to expect everybody to just jump into this is the format, love it or leave it?
If you do it as a, I'm sorry. If you do it as, okay, I compete for public art all the time, and I've seen a variety of processes and how they do the calls. And there is no standard, but then again, there is. So for instance, I think the first thing is to start an initiative to get ideas and then pick finalists. Like, so you could say, okay, we're going to pick, let's just say you pick 5 finalists, and that's when you bring the community in to hear how they feel about the ideas and get their input, and then ultimately, depending on the feedback, you have a selection committee that's made up of community members and,
I understand how that works.
But then,
yes.
And then ultimately, again, you let the community give you feedback, and that will give you some sense of direction of what to do.
We could keep brainstorming, but I want to give credit that Monuments Lab in Philadelphia is starting to tackle this really great. They have a great process and really transparent thing on their website. And then Brian Lee Jr.'s Co-Locate Design in New Orleans has a paper monuments project, closely related, has a great similar format. I don't want to go into telling that whole story, but check those out.
Thank you.
It's like, put your idea on paper and we'll turn it into something temporary, and then maybe that grows, maybe it grows, and it's a great process.
Thank you.
Hi there. I'm from Denver, actually, so welcome.
Hi.
So I took down some notes here. So obviously, a lot of these, some of them are more black and white than others. When you're talking about a Confederate monument, a lot of us have a pretty strong opinion of let's get rid of it. But some of these, to the point of this Sisters of Charity, for instance, and I'm actually pretty close to that community. My adopted grandma's a Sister of Charity. So they're an incredible organization, and they've done a lot of stuff. And here in Denver, they did a lot of hospice work with AIDS victims. So when you look at that, and then you look at the fact that, yes, they're also slave owners, nothing is in that situation black and white. How do you get to the point where you can be not analysis paralysis, saying, oh, well, this, but this, but this, but this, and then get to the point where you can make a decision with what needs to be done?
Yeah, I think for us, that was why instead of diving into evaluating specific artworks and getting lost in the pro and con columns, that we developed this principle and criteria. So it's kind of, my lawyer's not going to like this, but it's kind of like having a law that's interpreted per the specific case that you're looking at. So, the way that you evaluate Mother Catherine might be a little different from the way you evaluate a Confederate monument, and that's different from something else, right? So the idea of having these principles are a way to sort of guide that thinking and weigh that particular artwork against those principles and criteria. So I don't know if that really helps your question, but that was how we approached it, was to first think big picture about our values as a community, and then we'll start to address things one by one. The unanswered piece of it that we haven't quite figured out yet is, would we have some kind of procedure by which a citizen would say, I want a formal review of that particular piece? We don't know how that would work yet, but again, you can't just start evaluating everything in the city all at once, but if there was a process by which, you know, somebody sort of filled out a form and sent it in and said, I want to evaluate this piece, and then that put it into a formal process, so that you're responding to what the community wants to go into a formal evaluation on. Does that help?
That does help. And then a follow-up then, would you suggest that, you know, obviously you don't want the same person to be consistently your squeaky wheel saying, I want an evaluation of this and then whatever, but would you say you could reevaluate it in a certain length of time? Because obviously our understanding of the world changes and our values change as a culture.
Right.
So that maybe 10 years down the road, what was acceptable is no longer acceptable. Would you say that after X number of years you can reevaluate something?
Yeah, I think it would definitely have to have some specific policies involved, like, you know, if you submit something and it goes through this review process and whatever kind of review panel you have says, you know, all things considered, we think it's okay to stay, and the person turns around and resubmits it again right away, you know, there has to be some kind of like grace period in between. So that's the part we haven't quite figured out all the details of, but I think we know we need some kind of process like that. So now we have the principles, but we have to have a process, how we use them, right? Yeah. We're working on it.
Hi. Hi. So I came up with probably a quick question that we don't have time to answer, but as I'm looking at all of these monument issues, and a lot of dealing with context of historical monuments, like we address historical architecture, and many times these issues are integrated into historical architecture. So my thinking is the Americans with Disabilities Act became law, and it became very clear that we had an obligation as public stewards and as public, as citizens, to change buildings so that so accessibility could happen. The Civil Rights Act also became law. And I think that it's interesting to try to think about how these, the action's not clear when we're dealing with these historic monuments in a way that seems very clear when we're dealing with historic buildings, when we're talking about disability. And is this because we call these monuments works of artistic expression? Or how would you answer that?
Well,
I'm gonna use an example that's not gonna answer your question at all, but okay, in Louisville, one of the monuments that's under debate, you know, everyone wants to kind of dive into the historical research and do the homework and find the proof, right? Was this person a racist? Were they a segregationist or not? So there's all these anecdotes. This is about the Castleman figure, and there's anecdotes about how he had this major outburst about how you had to salute a military officer regardless of their race. And there are other anecdotes about how he was a figure of reconciliation. The one that's right at the middle is minutes of the Parks Commission. He was on the Parks Commission for 25 years. He was the president. So there is a particular part of the minutes where some members of the public were complaining about black residents using the tennis courts in one of the parks. And so the action of the Parks Commission was to create an additional set of tennis courts because the black residents deserved to also have tennis courts. So there's one side of the argument where people say that proves he was a segregationist, and we have another group that argues that proves that he was trying to make the parks accessible to everybody. So really it doesn't prove either one, but I think my non-answer is to say that unless there's a situation where we have specific irrefutable proof and something that doesn't have emotion I don't know how possible it is to come to the same resolution that we did in the other legal actions that you brought forward. Sorry for the non-answer.
Vinnie, do you want to go?
Your question is not clear to me, but I'm going to take a stab at it. And I'm going to use something that's going on right now. In New York City, Manhattan, the female power brokers got together and decided that they were going to take on Central Park because Central Park has 28 monuments and they're all men. So coincidentally, these women are all, the women who are involved in this process, they're all white. And rather than putting out a call for art and letting the artist choose to propose a tribute to women or propose a acknowledgement of women, these women made the decision for themselves who they wanted to go in the park first. They picked Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady. As a woman in New York, who coincidentally is African American, it made my jaw drop, because not only because those two women don't, I'm just going to say, matter to black women, I'm like, well, what about, and New York's a pretty diverse place, what about the Hispanic women? What about the Native American women? What about the, we have a myriad of ethnicities in Manhattan, and I'm like, how could you pick those two? So I was like, so my first response was offense. But it's supposed to be $1 million commission, so I'm like, okay, let me just hold on before I get, my emotions blocking me. Let me just do a little homework. So it's funny that I have become an artist that does historical pieces, because I hated history in school. But so I started researching, and I came up with documentation where these women made racist remarks when they were fighting for rights for women to vote and have, civil rights. They were racist. They didn't want former enslaved African men having the right to vote before them. There's lots of documentation of things they said to that nature. So now I'm like, you know what? I have other things to do. I'm not going to respond to that, because my gut reaction was, I don't have the time. I personally, and I'm willing to fight, but I don't have the time nor the inclination to take on this crew of women, because that would be so distracting from what I'm already doing, and I have other priorities. If no one else picks up that torch, those sculptures are going to go up, and they're going to think that they did a fine thing, and they're not going to really appreciate the fact that in that process of acknowledging, well, these women, they have somehow put everybody else on the fringe. I thought, I write for the newspaper. It's one of my original jobs. And I'm like, you should write an editorial on this. And I'm like, I don't have the time. So again, the question is, who's going to take the responsibility to challenge or to shepherd or to spearhead the right thing? Because that's how it gets done. Somebody's got to have the ability to discern what's right and what's not, and they have to have the time and the impetus to be a godmother to see that through to the end. A lot of people are not that committed, so a lot of stuff doesn't get done, or the process gets really slowed down. So this is why I'm not sure how to answer your question, because I'm kind of experiencing something myself, and I have committed to a lot. I can't do everything, nor can I motivate somebody else. So I don't know.
So I don't want to cut you off.
No, I'm
done.
done.
Okay. We have, I think, time for one more question, and then we are out of time for today.
Jimmy's question was so good. I don't know, mine's very myopic. But I'm with the Public Art Program in San Francisco, And even in progressive San Francisco, we don't have any Confederate monuments, but we do have some problematic monuments, and one of which we've been working for a year to take down. It's part of the Pioneer Monument in our Civic Center, directly in front of our City Hall. And it has a racist depiction of Native American, and we've been working diligently to bring it down. We are currently mired, it's been about a year, in just legal problems. And specifically, the district that this is in is landmarked, and we are stuck with the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation of historic properties and districts. We're in an appeals process now with our city. And in any event, I'm thinking along the lines of your processes, and we anticipate we're working on the long game, and it's proving to be a much longer game than we thought, even in our progressive city of San Francisco. But my question is, and we anticipate after this, even if we do, as we get through this process, we anticipate litigation, we anticipate being sued. And I'm wondering if you have experienced that as well and how you've dealt with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to depend on your state law and your district court, but our Confederate monument that was removed was also landmarked, and there was a lawsuit brought that claiming that the city did not have the authority or the ownership or the authority to move it, but it was dismissed in court twice, and so I think it's going to depend some on your state and district court.
Right. And so in anticipation of that, I mean, you brought it down and dealt with the land.
That's right. And but we should connect after, and we can give you the judge's ruling.
That'd be great. Thank you.
And I think it is really important to understand that in our system, too, our justice system, it's based on precedent. So even though it's terrifying as a city or anybody, individual, to think about getting sued and having to deal with legal actions, and this is why I do transactional work and not litigation, that is the way that laws change. That is the way that we can see some change. And so it's not necessarily a terrible thing to have a lawsuit as long as you have good people arguing the right positions.
We do.
All right, well, that wraps up our panel. Thank you very much for sticking it out all the way through. Certainly we'll be around afterwards if there are any other comments or questions that you'd like to talk to us about. Thank you.